in this house.
Now, we just watched Skinamarink last night, and let me just tell you, from the get-go, when the trailer of this movie came out, I was absolutely hooked already. I bought in, was all ready to go, was so excited to watch it, and after watching it, I mean, it has not changed. It's probably gotten even bigger, the excitement that I have for this movie. Now today we're going to be breaking down Skinamarink, kind of giving it a little light review. There will be some spoilers if you have not seen the movie. I would suggest going and seeing it. It is in theaters and select theaters. It is also on Shudder, so you can go watch it and then come back afterwards to watch this if you want to. If not, just giving you spoiler warnings ahead of time. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. That helps us grow, helps us continue to put out content. And like I said before in previous videos, we have a lot coming up, including Horror Hound in March. We are so excited for that. Bruce Campbell's going to be there. We're going to be filming the entire weekend, so make sure to check that out. And if you're there, say hi to us. Getting back to the topic at hand, Skinamarink is a movie that I believe isn't going to be for everybody. And I kind of assumed that when I saw the first trailer. You know, experimental horror is not for everybody, and it is for sure not for the general public. And what I mean by that is, you know, it isn't these mainstream horror movies. You know, there's a lot of people who get on TikTok and get on YouTube and do reviews of these movies, the exploitation films, the experimental horror, the analog horror, stuff like that. And it kind of makes people want to go watch it because they're like, oh my goodness, this movie's so scary, or there's like a challenge out. And then afterwards, those people come back and just shit on the entire movie the entire time and say that it's terrible, it didn't make sense, it was boring, whatever. It was overly gratuitous and overly violent. But what you have to understand is that this is art, and horror is definitely subjective. And when it comes to horror, that's the type of horror I like. Now, yes, I do like some traditional horror movies, especially 80s horror movies like Friday the 13th series, Nightmare on Elm Street series. And I do like, you know, some movies throughout the 2000s, like Rob Zombie's films and, you know, You're Next and Sinister. But the main chunk of movies, I would say post 2008, really, maybe 2009, have kind of been these big budget horror movies for the most part that don't feel good to me. You know, like Conjuring and The Nun and, you know, Annabelle and, I mean, let's be honest, anything with Blumhouse name on it for the most part, or James Wan's name on it, unfortunately. Uh, and the reason why I don't like those movies is because they don't feel original. It's the same stuff that's been done over and over again. It's, you know, jump scares and PG-13 and, you know, what can we do to make as much money at the box office as possible? And yes, I know this is becoming a rant on, you know, movies in general, and I'm sorry that you didn't come here for this, but I kind of need to get it out for you to get the point of what this movie means to people like me in the horror community. Now, especially recently, you know, you have movies like the Halloween series coming back, Texas Chainsaw Massacre trying to come back with some sort of reboot thing on Netflix that was terrible. You know, movies like the Scream series with their new one coming out, which, I mean, I said in my previous video is just not my thing. Megan, again, not my thing. I think it's like absolute ripoff of Child's Play, and especially a ripoff of like the really crappy newest remake of Child's Play. So when you're remaking a crappier movie, you know, you're just regurgitating the same bullcrap out there for people. And eventually that's going to push people like me to just not even want to support your films, not even want to watch them. And luckily there are still people out there that make experimental, low budget exploitation films like Skinamarink, and I am so happy about it. Now, to dig in a little bit about the backstory of how this came around, It is directed by Kyle Edward Ball. It was also created by him. I believe he wrote it as well. He really didn't have that big of a production crew around it, figuring it was such a low-budget film. And I believe that this is kind of like a retelling or a continuation. I don't think it's continuation. It's more of like a retelling of a previous short film that he already did on YouTube that is very much the same style, almost the same story in a sense. And this is kind of like, okay, I'm going to take that and I'm going to make it into a full-length film, which is his very first full-length film. And, you know, like I said, it's not going to be for everybody. And there's one film that really reminds me of this movie, you know, in not in a sense of like storyline, but a sense of like the feeling that you get when you watch it, kind of like the score, the very minimal dialogue. There's one particular film that I'm going to talk about later that really, really reminds me of this, and it makes me so happy that there is something like this now out there that I can watch instead of just this one singular thing over and over again. So the main story is set around these two kids. They both look fairly young. I would say one was probably 3 or 4, the other one 5 or 6. Both of them very young children. One is named Kevin, he's the younger one. The other one, Kaylee, that's the older one. And, you know, it kind of starts off a little bit confusing. You know, you hear the father's voice, you hear the children's voice talking at some points. There's just random things sort of happening. And then as it progresses, you start to realize that the dad is gone, the mother's nowhere to be found, and the kids are kind of trapped in this house now where the doors and the windows have kind of disappeared, and around them things are just changing, and there's noises, and they're not really sure what's going on. So a lot of the film is centered around them in the living room where they pulled up the couch to the TV. They were sleeping there almost every night. There's light dialogue every now and then about them questioning, like, is anybody going to come? How are we going to, you know, survive? Is dad with mom? And there's a lot of, like, underlying stuff that I'll get into in just a few minutes where you start to pinpoint possibly what the metaphor in this movie is, or what the whole entire, like, meaning behind it is. Now, as the movie moves on, you know, they start to hear noises upstairs. The TV starts turning itself on and off. It escalates very quickly to the point where there are chairs or Barbie dolls, like, floating on the ceiling. Very, very bizarre stuff that you would find in almost like a paranormal film. Just way darker and grittier and more real, I would say. The feeling of this movie legitimately feels real. The acting does not feel like acting. The kids' dialogue sounds exactly like kids just talking to themselves. Kids that are scared. That's what it sounds like. It is so real that you almost forget for a second while watching it that you're watching a movie. You almost get pulled into it being like a family, you know, film. Like somebody just taping this in their home. And that reminds me of another thing. I've been seeing a lot of stuff on Twitter calling this a found footage film. This in no way is a found footage film. If anybody says this is a found footage film, they are completely wrong. Yes, there are elements of found footage in this movie. Yes, there are, like, sort of the cinematography tricks that they do in found footage. Nobody has a camera. Nobody's walking around with a camera. That's not what's happening. It's not a found footage film. Partial of the film is set in a POV perspective of the children, sometimes walking around, sometimes getting something. The other parts of this movie are literally just situational set shots. That's all it is. It's camera set in one spot, looking directly at that spot. So whether that is a corner of the room, whether that's the ground, whether that's the ceiling, whether it's the TV, whether it's the couch, whether it's the hallway, there are so many different shots in this film, but they're just stationary shots. You could be looking at a doorway for 3 minutes straight. You could be looking at a black background with film grain for 2 minutes straight. That is that. So it's not a found footage film whatsoever, but it does kind of give off that vibe. So if you think this is a found footage film, I'm sorry to break your heart. This is not a found footage film. It is just an experimental analog film that kind of plays into the found footage look a little bit. Now, back to what I was saying, it ramps up real quick about the 45-minute part, where now they're going to start to see things. They're going to start to see their father and their mother, who we believe their mother had been gone the entire time. Their father seemed to be talking to the mother on the phone at the very beginning of the movie, talking about how Kevin had fell down the steps, but he didn't need stitches because he seemed like he was okay. And Kaylee said that he had been sleepwalking, which is going to be key to understanding the end of this movie. So when the mother appears, or when the father appears in the bedroom, you get the sense that they are not them. And it's not just like the light dialogue that is said. The father at one point tells Kaylee to look under the bed. She looks up from the bed, and the mother's on the other side of the bed. The father is gone. So that's when you start to notice that, oh, this isn't necessarily their father and mother. This is something playing tricks on them. This is something in this house playing tricks on them and making them believe that their mother and father are there. The film then proceeds to show the mom go into the closet. You hear a bunch of noises, almost like bones contorting. Then it opens up to them trying to convince Kaylee really to do things for them. And when she doesn't, there's a scene that will come out of nowhere. There's not a lot of jump scares in this movie, but there are definitely a few, and they are good jump scares, especially for like experimental horror. They don't usually try to jump scare you, but these ones are definitely fitting. They don't feel cheesy. They feel like genuine jump scares, and a couple of them got me. And this one is, they pan the camera up to the little girl's face, and she's just missing her eyes and her mouth. And it's like this screaming noise happens, and then it cuts abruptly. And it is such a cool scene. It's kind of the first time you get like kind of it's the first time you really get to look at anybody in the face in the movie. So you don't see anybody's face until that point, and I don't believe any time after that point you really see anybody's face. So they chose a good thing to do that with. That's cool to just kind of put that in the back burner and be like, okay, we're only going to show a face, and that's when something happens. So then it proceeds to just, try to come at Kevin then, because it states to Kevin that Kaylee didn't want to listen to directions. And so now Kevin is going to have to be the one that listens to directions. And from there, there's just absolute chaos. There's like one part where the phone rings and Kevin's on the phone with a 911 operator after calling 911. And the 911 operator is like talking to him and like trying to figure out what's going on because he had just gotten hurt because the thing told him to do something to hurt himself. And it all ends up being a big trick, and this thing just starts laughing at him because of it. And he's like asking like, was that you? And he's just laughing. And then like the scene ends, and it's such a cool scene. There's also a really cool scene with one of those really little old telephone toys that have like the wheels on them and the big eyes. Yeah, I'm sure you guys have seen it in the trailer or the thumbnail. There's a scene with that that's absolutely terrifying. That is a jump scare that caught me completely off guard. That is absolutely frightening. If you're alone watching this in the dark, that scene is going to get you, and you're never going to want to be around those toys ever again. But so on and so forth. This kind of goes on, and he's just trying to lure Kevin into everything, and then a bunch of stuff happens, and the ending happens, and I'm not going to ruin the ending. I'm not going to get into all of that. All I can say is I really enjoyed the ending. The ending kind of left you wondering what was going to happen. Are these kids safe now? Are they not safe now? Are they kind of stuck in this purgatory of like overlapping days of it just being dark and surrounded, and they cannot get out of this house? What happened to mom and dad? Were they dead the entire time? Were they not dead the entire time? We don't know. There is such a good ending that makes you think, and that's the best thing. And Kyle, the director, said that there is a deliberate meaning to this movie that he does not want to give away, because the point is to really think about the ending and interpret what it really means. And so that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to try to interpret it. And if you don't agree with my interpretation, that is completely fine. But I see it as a couple different ways that happen in this movie. One, commentary on divorce. Like I said, the mother is never in the house. She's never seen other than when the demon is kind of her. So when the kids are asking, did dad go with mom? I don't want to talk about mom. All of this stuff having to do with their mother. One thing I can think of is that this is kind of a tale about divorce. And there's one scene that makes me really think that, and that is when the demon kind of has control of the mom's figure in the bedroom after Kaylee gets done looking under the bed. She has her back turned towards Kaylee and she says, "You know, we love you and your brother very much." And if anybody knows anything about divorce, that is a very common thing for parents to say to children. So this makes me think of, is this a story about the mother leaving, the father having custody of the kids, and then how visually or mentally, I would say, emotionally, the kids would handle that? And it would kind of feel like you were isolated. It kind of feel like your house was torn apart. It didn't feel right. And maybe they couldn't find their dad because their dad has to work. He can't always be there and take care of them. And this is a little bit of a stretch, and I understand that. If you feel the same way, I get that it's a stretch. But I have another thing that I think would be even better for it to be what it means. And I think in my heart, this is what I truly believe the movie is about. So the second thing I think this movie is about is grief and loss and death. I don't believe they got a divorce. I think this movie is a whole entire story built around losing a family member, and especially losing a parent. And why I think that is, again, the mom is not there. Possibly they were having a hard time, something was happening, they maybe were going to get a divorce, and something happened to the mother where she passed away. And that left the father feeling guilty, that left the father feeling shameful about not being able to save his wife, the mother of his children. And it could be that this family was so torn apart, their house was so dark, their house was so demented with this feeling of loss and grief that the father decided to end it all. And just end it all. And whether that means for him, I could take it either way. End it for him, himself, and leave the children in this house, or end it for both him and his children. And now, the children, after being killed, we're kind of stuck in the purgatory of this house. And so that is a very dark turn to this movie, to where, if you think about it, and this is what you take from it, and this is what you believe it's about, like me, that these kids are dead the entire time. And the reason why they are here is because they were killed and they're in purgatory and they're in their house, and that's the reason why they can't escape, and that's the reason why the demon's trying to get them, and the demons in this house taking the form of their mother and father. Again, I know this is a stretch, but this is just what I saw from the movie itself, and me trying to read deeper into it, and I may be reading way too deep into it. And the third thing that I think this movie is about, or could be about, is just a haunting. It could just be a haunting movie. At its base core, that's what it is. And it could be a movie where said mother lets something into the house, whether that was a spirit, a demon, anything you want to call it, a poltergeist. It took control of her. It took control of the father. Then it took control of Kaylee. Then it took control of Kevin. And little by little, it was playing these little tricks. It was having fun. It was seeing who could engage in it. And now remember when I said that Kevin was sleepwalking. And this is the biggest pinpoint to this being a haunting movie, is there is one part where Kevin is sitting in the hallway and it looks like he's almost playing hide and seek or playing with somebody. And this is towards the beginning of the movie, that you don't really realize that he could be playing with this spirit or this demon that contacted him first to kind of work his way through the family to get to him, to get him to do what he wanted to do. And I believe that's what most people are going to take from this, is that it's just a haunting movie. It's supposed to feel like you're afraid of the dark. It's supposed to feel like you're claustrophobic. And that's what I think most people are going to take away from it. They're not going to read deeper into it like I did. But either way, whatever you think is happening in this movie, whatever you think the story is about, if you believe in one of the three things I said or something completely different, that's not going to change what this movie means or what this movie stands for or how great this movie is. Now, one more thing is what this movie reminds me of. And I said this earlier, this movie reminds me of another experimental analog horror movie that is one of my favorite movies of all time, and that is Begotten. Now, if you don't know what Begotten is, it is a late 90s art house experimental horror. I know that the director didn't necessarily want to call it a horror movie, even though it is an experimental analog horror movie. He would rather it be called an art piece because I believe that it was submitted to an art festival. I could be wrong, but if I'm recollecting right, I believe that it had something to do with like an art festival or something like that, where it was considered an art piece, not necessarily a horror film. But that's beside the point. It is still an experimental horror film. It is still an analog horror film. Begotten, if you've never heard of it, I'd suggest go watching it if you really, really like stuff like Skinamarink. It is high contrast black and white. There is no dialogue. It is completely like ominous noises the entire time and ominous music. And it is separated into 3 parts throughout the movie. I'm not going to go into detail. Maybe I'll make another video on Begotten or watch it and post it as me reacting to it as being a fan. That way you guys can kind of see bits and pieces of it. But this film really reminds me of Begotten, and not the story. The stories are completely different. This setup is kind of also completely different. You know, Begotten is kind of set in 3 different areas. This movie is set in one house. But what really reminds me of Begotten is not only the cinematography, you know, the really grainy, like I said, analog horror, but the way it made me feel. I remember the first time I watched Begotten, and I was in a dark room. This is an hour-long film. It's about 60 minutes, maybe less, and I was just drawn to the TV, and I was just like, what in the world is this? I've never seen anything like it. This movie is absolutely terrifying, creepy, scary, wild. And this is the same thing I feel about Skinamarink. It makes you feel uneasy. It makes you feel like you're not sure what's going to happen next, and you kind of prepare yourself. And it kind of goes back to that being afraid of the dark thing. It really brings that fear to you because there's so many scenes that are so dark that you can't see anything, or you're trying to figure out what you're looking at, that it builds this anticipation, it builds this fear inside of you where you're just waiting for something to happen. And Begotten was sort of the same way. Begotten was a lot more gorier, a little less, I would say, jump scary and more of just shock value. But they're very similar in my mind as far as the abstract nature of the film. The director deciding to go with certain things that he wanted to talk about. There's a lot to like with both of them, and they're both very similar in my opinion. Some people may not agree with that. I've seen people compare it to Blair Witch. Sure, I guess. I don't see it. I think it is way more obscure. I think it is way more experimental than what Blair Witch is. This is the purest form of experimental horror movies. I mean, not anybody can sit and watch a movie with just straight shots of hallways and doors and corners of rooms for an hour and a half. But I did, and I loved it. So thank you, Kyle Edward Ball. I hope you continue to make movies. I hope you continue to push the ball, because I hate to tell you, horror has not done great recently. They have not. Outside of Ty West, outside of A24, outside of... I mean, really, that's it. I'm sorry, dude. I'm sorry. The Terrifier films don't do anything for me. I love violent exploitation films, but Terrifier doesn't feel like that to me. The Terrifier series has felt like really cheap, low budget, shock factor horror that does not have any meaning to it. Which that's coming from a huge Cannibal Holocaust fan like myself, or a huge Serbian film fan like myself, or a huge Antichrist fan like myself, or anything Lars von Trier's done. But The issue is that the ball is not being rolled. And something happened with Skinamarink where the ball was starting to be rolled now. And it's starting to be rolled to where we can finally get back to doing experimental horror, analog horror, exploitation films. We can finally start to get back to doing those things, and those are the films I love.